The sky above the Pacific was not blue. To the men of the 5th Air Force, it was a bleached, punishing white, a dome of shimmering heat that pressed down on the jungle below and turned the aluminum skins of their bombers into ovens. And in that white sky, the black puffs of flak and the silver glints of enemy fighters didn't look like war. They looked like a deadly, mechanical infection. Inside the shuddering belly of a B-24 Liberator, a plane her crews called the Flying Boxcar, for its slab-sided, workmanlike ugliness, a young man named Arthur Benko was about to do something his fellow gunners would call, to his face, completely stupid. He wasn't a born killer. He wasn't a legendary ace with a steely gaze. He was a farm kid from Ohio who missed the smell of rain on dry earth. But in his hands, he held a .50 caliber Browning machine gun, a weapon of brute industrial force, and in his mind he held a simmering frustration. The official doctrine, the sacred gospel passed down from training manuals and veteran crew chiefs, wasn't working. Not out here. Not against the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0. A creature of such agility, it seemed to laugh at the laws of physics. The standard practice was the burst, a careful, conservative 3 to 5 round burst, conserve ammunition, make every shot count. It was logical, prudent, and in the swirling, chaotic hell of a dogfight over a ball or WWII, it was utterly futile. You'd lead the zero, squeeze the trigger for a heart, beat, and watch your tracers, those glowing red coals streaking through the air, pass harmlessly behind a fighter that had already sliced away. The zero would roll, pivot on a wingtip, and come back at you, its own 7mm guns stitching a line of holes in your wing. Benko watched good men, friends who shared his cigarette ration and his fears in the humid dark of the barracks, die following that doctrine. He watched liberators, each a fortress carrying 10 souls, spiral down into the green oblivion of the jungle because their defensive fire was a polite, ineffectual spatter against a swarm of determined hornets. And one day, the frustration boiled over. He looked at the belt of .50 caliber cartridges feeding into his gun, each round nearly half a pound of explosive power. He thought about the Zero's thin, lightweight airframe, built for performance, not punishment, and he decided to break the rules. He would not fire bursts. He would hold the trigger down. He would pour a river of lead, a continuous, unbroken stream of fire so dense, so overwhelming, that even a Zero couldn't dance through it. When he mentioned this idea, the reaction was predictable. "You'll burn the barrel out in 30 seconds, said his crew chief, a man with grease perpetually under his fingernails. "You'll waste half your ammo on empty sky," argued the tail gunner, a pragmatist from Chicago. "They'll marshal you for wasting government property," muttered the radio operator. Benko listened, nodded, and quietly began to plan his rebellion. His moment came on a milk run that turned hot. Their target was a Japanese airfield on New Guinea. The flak was light, the bombing run textbook. Then, from the sun, they dropped. A dozen Zeros, their radial engines screaming. The intercom erupted in a cacophony of shouts. "Fighters! 3 o'clock high! Bandits on the tail! They're coming in fast!" The bomber formation tightened up, each plane seeking the protective crossfire of its neighbors. The air filled with the sour smell of cordite and the metallic clatter of spent cartridges. Benko, in his waist gun position, the wind screaming through the open window, saw a Zero lining up for a head on pass against the lead bomber. It was a classic, fearless Japanese tactic. He didn't calculate. He didn't aim in the traditional sense. He simply pointed his gun at a point in space ahead of the diving fighter, took a deep breath against the slipstream, and held the trigger down. The Browning roared to life, not with its usual staccato pop, 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 but with a sustained, deafening, industrial snarl. The vibration was immense, climbing up his arms, rattling his teeth. The belt of ammunition snaked and leaped like a live thing. A solid stream of red tracers, not intermittent dots but a glowing laser beam, reached out across the sky. He wasn't firing at the Zero, he was painting a wall of fire in front of it. The Zero pilot, committed to his dive, had two choices: fly through it or break off. He tried to jink, a subtle roll, but Benko, his arms absorbing the gun's thunder, walked the torrent of lead. It was like using a fire hose. You didn't aim the droplet, you aimed the flow. The stream of armor, piercing and incendiary rounds walked up the Zero's engine cowling, through the cockpit canopy, and into the wing root. There was no dramatic explosion. One moment the Zero was a sleek, deadly silhouette. The next, it was a shattered cloud of debris, disintegrating under the sheer volumetric weight of metal thrown at it. It was over in 4 seconds. 4 seconds of continuous fire, a blasphemous waste of ammunition, according to the book. On the intercom, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the hiss of static. Then, the pilot's voice, crackling with disbelief. What in hell was that? Who just fired a whole damned ammo box? Benko didn't answer. He was already scanning the sky, his ears ringing, the barrel of his gun smoking, a ghostly wisp in the rushing air. He saw another Zero banking around for another pass. He swung his gun, led the target just a hair, and again, held the trigger down. Another sustained, roaring blast. This time, the Zero's wing sheared off cleanly, spinning away into the blue. 2 kills in under a minute. 2 kills with a method that was supposed to be impossible. The mission returned to base. The debriefing was tense. The intelligence officer wanted a round-by-round account. Benko told the truth. He held the trigger. He fired continuously. The crew chief inspected the gun barrel. It was badly worn, almost shot out. It was proof of his profligacy. But it was also proof of 2 confirmed kills, with gun camera footage to back it up. The squadron commander, a hardened colonel who had seen too many planes not come back, looked at the data. He looked at the worn barrel. He looked at Benko's face, still smudged with oil and sweat. He didn't praise him. He didn't reprimand him. He simply said, "If it's stupid but it works, it isn't stupid." But, Sergeant, you are now responsible for figuring out how to make it work without burning up $1,000 gun barrel on every mission. And with that, Arthur Benko, the farm kid from Ohio, was given a backhanded permission to reinvent aerial gunnery. He became a man obsessed. He wasn't just a gunner anymore, he was an engineer, a ballistician, an innovator under fire. His quest to perfect his stupid trick would lead him into a world of physics and metallurgy, and it would require him to solve a series of brutal, practical problems that stood between his theory and making him the most lethal defensive gunner in the vast, cruel theater of the Pacific War. The first problem was the most obvious: the barrel. A .50 caliber Browning machine gun barrel wasn't designed for sustained fire. It was a masterpiece of engineering, but its metallurgy had limits. Fired in short bursts, the steel had time to dissipate the intense, friction-generated heat. Held continuously, the temperature would soar past 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel would soften, lose its dimensional stability, and the rifling, the spiral grooves that spun the bullet for accuracy, would begin to erode. After that first mission, Benko's barrel was so hot you could have fried an egg on it, and its accuracy was shot, literally. He had traded a barrel for 2 zeros. On a strategic level, it was a bargain. On a logistical level, in a theater where every spare part had to be flown or shipped across 10,000 miles of ocean, it was a potential nightmare. Benko couldn't become a one-man crisis for the supply chain. So, he started haunting the squadron's maintenance shack. He befriended armorers, men who lived in a world of packing grace and headspace gauges. He asked questions that sounded heretical. What if we cooled it faster? Could we swap barrels quicker? The standard procedure for a hot gun was to let it cool. In combat, you don't have minutes, you have seconds. Benko, drawing on the kind of mechanical intuition bred on a farm, proposed a radical solution: forced air cooling. He scavenged. He tinkered. From a wrecked C-47 transport, he procured a small, electric cabin fan. With the help of a skeptical but intrigued metal worker from the ground crew, he fashioned a crude shroud that could be clamped around the barrel of the waste gun. It wasn't pretty. It was a lash-up of sheet metal, rivets, and wiring that snaked back to the bomber's electrical system. The crew chief took one look at it and shook his head. "You're gonna blow a fuse and be left with a fancy paperweight, Benko." On the next mission, he tested it. As he prepared for his first long burst, he flipped the switch. The fan whirred to life, pushing the slipstream air into a concentrated stream around the barrel. He fired. The roar was the same. The vibration was the same. But when he released the trigger after a 10-second torrent of fire, he cautiously touched the shroud. It was warm, not searing. The barrel had survived. It was a eureka moment born of necessity and duct tape. But cooling the barrel was only half the battle. The second problem was control. A .50 caliber machine gun, when fired, doesn't just send bullets out, it delivers tremendous kinetic force backward into the gunner's body. This is recoil. In bursts, it's a manageable series of jabs. In a continuous stream, it becomes a sustained, bulldozing push that can literally walk the gunner backward, throwing his aim off completely. Benko's initial fire hose method was powerful but crude. He was painting the sky, but to be a true artist of death, he needed a scalpel, not just a sledgehammer. He needed to control the hose. He studied the gun mount. The standard flexible mount for the waste guns gave him mobility, but was inherently unstable. The key, he realized, was to use the recoil itself as part of the aiming mechanism. Instead of fighting the gun's push, he began to lean into it, using his whole body as a hydraulic dampener. He adjusted his stance, planting his feet wider, bending his knees, becoming one with the gun's rhythm. He learned to make tiny, micro corrections with his hips and shoulders, guiding the stream of fire rather than pointing it. It was a physical, almost athletic discipline. He would come back from missions drenched in sweat, muscles aching as if he'd fought a boxing match, his shoulders bruised from the constant pounding. But he was gaining control. The stream of fire was becoming a precise, lethal tool. The third problem was the most cerebral: prediction. Ammunition was still finite. Even with his method, he couldn't simply hold the trigger down from takeoff to landing. He had to know when to unleash the storm. This required a deep, almost intuitive understanding of fighter tactics. He stopped seeing the Zeros as mere targets and started seeing them as pilots making decisions. He studied their attack patterns. The head on pass was a favorite, but so was the high side attack from the beam, and the dangerous tail on approach where they would try to sit on your six. For each, Benko began to develop a trigger point, a moment of commitment from the fighter pilot when his flight path became predictable for a critical second. For a head-on attack, it was the moment the Zero's nose steadied, the wings stopped wobbling, and it became a speck growing with terrifying speed. That's when you laid your wall of fire directly in its path. For a beam attack, it was the instant the fighter started its roll into the gunnery run. You'd lead its roll with your stream, forcing the pilot to fly into it or abort. Benko spent hours in the ready room, not playing cards, but staring at recognition posters, running drills in his mind. He was building a mental library of angles and speeds. His fellow gunners noticed a change. The nervous farm kid was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused professional whose eyes seemed to see the geometry of the battle before it unfolded. They began to call his method, with a mixture of awe and irony, the Benko Ho's job. Word spread, first within his squadron, then to the neighboring ones. Some pilots requested him specifically for their crews. His bomber, its fuselage marked with small, painted rising sun flags for each of his confirmed kills, developed a reputation. The Japanese pilots learned to recognize it too. Intelligence intercepts and reports from other crews suggested the enemy radio chatter had a new phrase for the B-24 with the devastating waist gunner, the streamer. They would warn each other to avoid its beam. Benko had become a tactical phenomenon. But his greatest test, and the final validation of his system, was yet to come. It would arrive not in the clear skies over a sea, but in the thick, murderous air over the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul, a place the aircrews had christened the fortress. The mission briefing was grim, maximum effort. Every serviceable B-24 and B-17 was to hit the harbor and airfields. Intelligence expected stiff opposition. That was the Air Force's polite way of saying they were going to fly into a hornet's nest of Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. As Benko's liberator, the Ohio Avenger, lumbered off the coral runway, heavy with bombs and fuel, he went through his ritual. He checked his modified cooling fan. He traced the ammo belts, ensuring they were free of kinks. He flexed his hands and rolled his shoulders. Today, he knew, would not be about single kills. It would be about survival, about volume, about being the keeper of a deadly perimeter around his 10-man world. The flak began first, a polite peppering that grew into a black, smudgy wall of explosions that shook the plane like a tin can in a hailstorm. Then came the fighters. Not a dozen. It looked like 30, 40, maybe more, a swirling, silver galaxy of anger. The formation tightened until the wings of the bombers seemed almost to touch, the air filled with the crump of flak and the higher, pitched whine of fighter engines. The intercom was a tense, clipped symphony of calls. Benko saw a zero break from the pack, aiming for a B-17 on their left flank. Without thinking, he traversed his gun and, judging the lead, unleashed a 3-second stream. The Zero, focused on its prey, flew straight into the maelstrom. It peeled away, trailing smoke, its attack broken. Another came from high at 2 o'clock. A shorter burst. A miss, but it forced the fighter to jink violently, spoiling its aim. Benko was no longer just shooting at fighters. He was conducting a deadly orchestra, playing bursts of fire to disrupt, to deter, to kill. He was managing his ammunition, his barrel temperature, his physical stamina. He was a machine operator on the most brutal assembly line imaginable. Then, the call came he dreaded.
"Waist gunner, we've got one on our tail. He's lining up on our 6.
The tail gunner's voice was tight with panic. The tail position was vulnerable. A skilled Zero pilot could sit back there and pick a bomber apart. Benko had no direct shot. The geometry was impossible. But he had prepared for this. He shouted to the other waist gunner on the opposite side of the plane. "On my mark. Open the bomb bay."
Just a crack.
It was insane. Opening the bomb bay in combat was asking for trouble. But the pilot, trusting Benko's instinct, echoed the order. "Do it." Benko braced himself against the fuselage, pointed his gun not out the window, but at a steep angle downward and aft, through the narrow gap of the opening bomb bay doors. He couldn't see the Zero. He was firing blind. based solely on the tail gunner's frantic directions.
He's steady! He's steady!
Now, Benko held the trigger. The gun roared in the confined space, the sound deafening. He fired a 5-second torrent through the bomb bay, a waterfall of lead pouring into the sky behind them. The stream of tracers vanished into the void. For a second, nothing. Then, the tail gunner's voice, shrill with disbelief. "You got him!" "By God."
"Benko, you got him! He just came apart! The whole nose is gone!"
It was a shot born of desperation, spatial reasoning, and absolute trust in the volume of his fire. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. By the time the Ohio Avenger crossed the coast back into friendly territory, Benko's gun barrels were replaced twice, his ammo boxes were empty, and his body was one giant tremor. But they were alive, and the squadrons after action reports would credit him with 4 confirmed kills and 6 damaged. That day, a staggering number for a defensive gunner on a single mission. The myth of the stupid trick was dead. In its place was a new, hard-won doctrine. Soon, technical bulletins from headquarters would begin to circulate, discussing sustained fire techniques for area denial and improvised barrel cooling methods. They never mentioned Sergeant Arthur Benko by name. But every gunner in the 5th Air Force knew where it came from. He had looked into the face of conventional wisdom, saw it was getting men killed, and had the stubborn, Midwestern courage to try something else. He didn't have a hero's vision, he had a mechanic's insight. And in the vast, impersonal machinery of the war, that insight gave him and his crewmates a fighting chance. But this is not where Arthur Benko's story ends, because the true impact of a man like him isn't just measured in painted flags on a fuselage. It's measured in the quiet moments after the engines shut down, in the conversations that never made the official reports, and in the long shadow his stupid trick would cast over the very nature of aerial combat. The real cost and the real legacy was just beginning to reveal itself. The aftermath of a mission was a world apart from the chaos of the sky. The roar of engines gave way to a ringing silence that felt heavier than sound. The adrenaline, a chemical fire that had kept muscles taut and senses razor-sharp, would drain away, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. For Arthur Benko, climbing out of the waist gun position after the Rabaul raid, this transition was always acute. His hands, which had been steady as granite on the gun's triggers, now shook uncontrollably as he tried to light a cigarette. The smell of cordite was baked into his uniform, a pungent ghost that would linger for days. The crew of the Ohio Avenger moved like sleepwalkers through the post-mission ritual, debriefing with the intelligence officers, who spoke in calm, analytical tones about things that had been matters of life and death an hour before, the mechanical act of filing past the mess tent. Where food tasted like ash, Benko would give his report in short, flat sentences. Engaged multiple bandits from the beam. Employed sustained fire. One confirmed kill at coordinates, another probable. He was a data point now, a line in a ledger. The worn-out barrels of his guns were collected for re-lining, curiosities for the armorers. The kills were confirmed, the probables debated. He would receive a slap on the back, a nod from the colonel. But the real conversation happened later, in the shadows of the Quonset hut, under the weak yellow glow of a single bulb, with the ever-present hum of jungle insects providing the soundtrack. It was here that the other gunners would find him. Young men, some still teenagers, with faces still soft, but eyes grown old too fast. They came not to praise, but to learn. They had heard the stories, seen the gun camera footage that was now being passed around like sacred text. They saw the stream of tracers, unbroken and terrifying in its density, and they wanted the secret. Benko, a new replacement gunner, his voice still cracking with nervous energy, would ask, "They said you just hold it down. Is that true? Don't you run out?" Benko would look at him, seeing himself from a year ago, scared, desperate for anything that would increase the odds. He wouldn't give a pep talk. He'd give a physics lesson. "It's not about holding it down," he'd say, his voice quiet but firm. "It's about knowing when to hold it down. It's about heat and angles. Your barrel is a resource. Your ammo is a resource. Your strength is a resource. You spend them when the payoff is highest." He'd sketch diagrams in the dust with a finger. He'd explain the fan, not as a miracle, but as a simple heat exchange problem. He'd talk about the recoil, not as an enemy, but as a tool to be harnessed. He was demystifying his own legend, turning it into a set of reproducible, brutal facts. This was the true beginning of his legacy, not the official bulletins, but this grassroots, hut-level transmission of knowledge. He was creating disciples, but with this notoriety came a different kind of weight. The military machine, for all its rigid hierarchy, is a superstitious organism. Crews began to request transfers to get on Benko's bomber. To fly with the streamer was considered a lucky charm. Command, sensing a potent morale tool, began to feature him in brief, sanitized press reports back home. He became the deadliest gunner in the Pacific, a headline that sat uneasily on his shoulders. He didn't feel deadly. He felt tired. He felt the weight of expectation every time he manned his gun. It was no longer just about protecting his crew. It was about living up to a story, and the stories grew with each telling. In the bars of Sydney, on the rare liberties, pilots from other squadrons would buy him beers and ask him to describe the kills. He'd give terse, undramatic accounts. They wanted heroics. He gave them mechanics. They wanted to hear about the thrill of victory. He could only think about the precise, grinding process of achieving it. The war correspondent who interviewed him was frustrated by his lack of colorful quotes. "Weren't you scared?" the correspondent asked. Benko thought for a long moment. "Scared is what you are before," he said finally. "During, you're just busy. There's a checklist in your head. Fan on, lead the turn, watch the tracers, feel the heat, scan for the next one. There's no room for scared." The correspondent left, disappointed. He didn't understand that Benko's heroism wasn't emotional. It was profoundly, deeply procedural. This procedural nature of his success led him to his next, and perhaps most significant, innovation collaboration. He realized that his fire hose method, while powerful, created a vulnerability. During his long attention-consuming bursts, other sectors of the bomber were left uncovered. He was solving one problem, but potentially creating another. The solution came not from a flash of genius, but from a conversation with the tail gunner, a laconic Texan named Perkins. After a mission where a Zero had slipped in while Benko was engaged on the other side, Perkins had said, dryly, "You know, Benko, while you're putting on your light show over there, my side of the dance hall gets mighty popular." It was a joke, but it held a truth. Benko started thinking of the bomber not as a platform for individual gunners, but as a single, integrated weapons system. He began to coordinate with the other gunners on his crew, the tail, the ball turret, the top turret. He developed simple, clear signals. He would call out targets not just for himself, but to direct the fire of others. "Perkins, I'm covering high right, you watch low left." He created overlapping fields of fire, turning the Ohio Avenger from a collection of individual defensive points into a coordinated, bristling porcupine. He shared his cooling ideas with the top turret gunner, who suffered from even worse heat buildup. They adapted the fan concept, using scavenged parts to create a rudimentary system. The crew became a unit of shared, specialized knowledge. Their efficiency skyrocketed. Their kill counts, as a crew, became the stuff of squadron legend. Benko was no longer just a master gunner, he was becoming a tactical coordinator. A force multiplier. He proved that innovation wasn't just about a new gadget or technique, it was about a new way of thinking, a new way of working together under pressure. Yet, for all this tactical evolution, the core reality of his war remained one of visceral, terrifying intimacy. He didn't destroy abstractions called bandits. He killed young men. He saw them up close. Through his gun sight, he saw the red, meatball, insignia on the wings, saw the canopy glass glint in the sun, saw sometimes, horrifyingly, the outline of a helmeted head in the cockpit. When his stream of fire found its mark, he didn't see a plane explode in a Hollywood fireball. He saw pieces come off, a wing folding back, a canopy shattering, a trail of smoke and oil turning into a funeral pyre. He saw parachutes sometimes, white blossoms against the green jungle or blue sea, and he would feel a complex, unspoken relief. But often, there were no chutes. The Zero's design, its lightweight construction that gave it such agility, made it violently unforgiving when hit. It would come apart, and in those moments, the mechanical focus would break, and a cold, quiet thought would slip through. That was a person. He had a mother. He was probably as scared as I am. He never spoke of this, not to the reporters, not to the other gunners seeking technical advice. Not even in the hushed confessions of the Quonset hut late at night. This was the private counterweight to his public legend. Every rising sun flag painted on the fuselage was not just a trophy, it was a ghost. He carried them all. The stupid trick had made him effective, had saved his friends, had maybe even shortened the war by a microscopic fraction. But it had also made him a more efficient killer, and that efficiency came with a psychic tax that no medal or headline could offset. He fought not with hatred for the enemy, but with a profound, desperate love for the 9 men who shared his aluminum shell. His river of fire was not an act of aggression, it was an act of supreme, violent protection. He built his wall of lead not to conquer territory, but to defend a tiny, moving piece of home. The smell of coffee from the thermos, the bad jokes over the intercom, the shared dream of a future beyond the next mission. This was the human truth at the heart of the technical marvel. Arthur Benko wasn't a natural warrior. He was a craftsman who, through necessity and stubbornness, had perfected his terrible craft to shelter the fragile humanity entrusted to him. And as the war ground on, as the missions blurred into a numbing sequence of fear, focus, and exhaustion, this role as protector began to define him more than the kills ever could. The final stage of his journey would not be about perfecting the shot, but about confronting the ultimate limit of his skill and learning what it meant to be a leader when the mathematics of survival finally broke down. Standardized, new gunners were taught the principles of sustained fire and thermal management he'd forged in combat. But for Benko, the final lesson wasn't about technique, it was about endurance. There is a limit to how much one can see, how much one can carry. The heroism the world wanted was a single, shining moment. His was a slow, relentless accumulation of duty performed in a freezing, roaring wind. For men who depended on him. He never saw himself as the deadliest. He was simply the one who refused to quit solving the problem in front of him. When the guns finally fell silent, Arthur Benko put down his tools and went home to Ohio. He rarely spoke of the river of fire he had unleashed, of the title they gave him. The true story, the one he carried, wasn't about a trick. It was about the weight of a trigger, the value of a second, and the invisible bonds that held 10 men together in the white, unforgiving sky. That was the victory no medal could ever represent.